Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program, Behind the Quilts, a musical experience, which is offered as a live stream event in conjunction with the exhibit Quilts and the Stories They Tell that's currently at the Sandy Spring Museum in Sandy Spring, Maryland. I'm Lauren Kingsland. I'm a quilt maker and a teacher and the executive producer of the exhibit. First tonight, we'll have a tour of about 40 quilts to share with you. Then we will hear from Grammy award-winning musicians, Cathy, Fink, and Marcie Marxer. We'll learn about the Uhuru Quilters Guild from founder Carol Williams and guild member Tammy Morrow, both of whom have pieces in the show. And finally, Allison Weiss, the director of the museum, will moderate a question and answer period. Before we begin the program, a few thank yous are needed. First of all, thank you to Maxine Morgan for she deserves a special mention as the liaison to, yes, yay, a round of applause for Maxine for her heroic coordinating of the call to artists, the jurying, the photo shoot, collecting the quilts in display-ready condition, and personally delivering all of the Uhuru Quilters Guild quilts to the museum for us. Thanks, Maxine. This would not have been the show it is if it weren't for your hard work. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Cathy Fink for her boundless energy and her partnership. Her desire to make better quilts led to our application for a Maryland State Arts Council grant that kept us quilting together even during the pandemic. We both adapted to 2020 together. One of my very first Zoom lessons was with Cathy, who was in mountain retreat in North Carolina. I was still here in Maryland, and we were trying to do this, which we've learned, but thank you, Cathy. Cathy envisioned this concert and has been the driving force behind tonight's live stream event. Cathy has quilts in the show as a result of our apprenticeship together, and her quilts authentically reflect her stories and represent hours of quilting experimentation as she stepped out of her comfort zone as a successful musician to try another medium. Bravo, Cathy. I want to thank Sandy Spring Museum for their partnership in allowing an in-person exhibit to happen here during the pandemic with strict social distancing and cleaning, of course, and masks and all of that. Thank you to the Sandy Springs staff for their support of this and the other virtual events that were related to the quilt show. We put this exhibit into their schedule in January of 2020, little suspecting what was going to happen in that intervening year. So they have worked really well with us to try to let this continue to happen, even though we had to do it in a little different way. The performance tonight is supported in part by the Maryland State Arts Council. The MSAC involvement, in fact, began in 2019 with the Folk Life Apprenticeship Grant with Cathy, and we're very grateful for their current support for the artists and the events related to this exhibit. Thank you also to Jim Robeson Productions for the videography of the tour you're going to see and tonight's musical segments. Art, music, and stories are forms of communication. Without an audience, a listener, a witness, they can be very one-sided conversations. Thank you for being here tonight to hear our stories. Please enjoy Quilts and the Stories They Tell.
Hello, I'm Lauren Kingsland. Today I'm at the Sandy Spring Museum in Sandy Spring, Maryland, to share with you an exhibit called Quilts and the Stories They Tell. There are 10 artists whose work is represented here. Behind me is the work of Cathy Fink, who is a Grammy award-winning musician. And this exhibit came to be because Cathy approached me about studying with me through a grant from the Maryland State Arts Council, an apprenticeship grant. I'm a quilt making teacher for the Smithsonian. I've made quilts and exhibited quilts for many, many years. So I was delighted to think about working with Cathy to help her develop her skills as a story quilt maker. The work that Cathy did, Cathy has 6 pieces in the exhibit. I have pieces from my life's work that are particularly story pieces. And we really wanted to include stories from other voices in this. I met Angela Lanier, whose work is included in this exhibit, when she and I were working on Humanities Days at Montgomery College. Angela is a faculty member at Montgomery College here in Montgomery County, Maryland. And Angela is a member of the Uhuru Quilters Guild. So I was talking to Angela about quilts because it's something we both really care about. And she offered to approach her guild about contributing their story quilts. So thank you, Angela, for the introduction to the Uhuru Quilters Guild of Prince George's County. And this is a primarily African-American quilt guild. I'm just thrilled to have a wide variety of voices telling their stories in this exhibit. Each of the quilts, I'll be talking about the show in detail, but each of the quilts tells a particular story of the maker, and that's really interesting. But the quilt also tells, just by what it is, tells the story of who the maker is, the elements of material culture, if you've thought about that, who the maker is, what her life experience has been, what's her education, what materials are available to her, what has happened to her in her life, how much time she has to work on this, what kind of a workspace she has. Everything about the maker shows up in the quilt, in addition to the story of the story that she thinks she's trying to tell. So there's a lot of subtext. This piece is one of mine. This is called Modulation. The story behind this is that my older son was about to leave home, about to go out into the world. So here's my house and myself and my husband and our other son. And there we are in our little safe house, and one person is about to leave. So it's about hopefulness and the natural cycle of things. This was the only way I could talk about that. This quilt is by Shirley Hodge. It's called Fink, about Aretha Franklin. I believe there have been challenges in the Uhuru Guild that have to do with music that everybody loves. So this is part of that. And next to Fink, by Shirley Hodge, is a piece by Catherine Wilson called Sankofa Beauty. And it incorporates 2 Adinkra symbols, Sankofa and Dwafe. So the story of that is what Catherine was trying to explain. This piece is by Carol Williams. It's called African Ladies. And this was in honor of a book by Margaret Musgrove called Ashanti to Zulu, which was an alphabet book for children that was particularly Afrocentric. She was very excited about that book and made this piece. This piece is by Catherine Wilson. It's called Ancestral Spirits, and it addresses the transatlantic passage and honors those lost during that time. The gold, she said, the gold represents the value of the human cargo. This is Cathy Fink's piece called Names. It's about the AIDS quilt project in 1989, panels to commemorate people who had died of AIDS. The Names Quilt Project's director, Cleve Jones, heard a song that Cathy wrote about this project and wrote to her, and she had a connection then with Cleve Jones. This quilt is also by Cathy Fink. It's called Empty Chairs, and she was thinking about her response to the pandemic. This is also photo transfer images of pictures that she took of chairs that are now empty as a symbol of how how the pandemic has affected us and our connection with people. This quilt is by Tammy Morrow, called Aretha Franklin. And Aretha Franklin is Tammy's favorite performer, Queen of Soul. This quilt was made as part of an Uhuru challenge. Here we have Angela Lanier's A Tale of Japan. Angela was fortunate enough to have an extended visit to Japan, and she has shared her trip, all the highlights of her trip, with us in this quilt. Winifred Wallace made this piece in response to the tragedy of the falling of the Twin Towers on 9/11 in New York. Another one of the great outpouring of feeling, individual feeling and civic grief that happened around the time of 9/11. Sandra Ely's piece, Bugging Sisters, is about her own childhood with her sister and the things that were important to them at that point. When you look closely at this piece, there are little tiny praying mantises all over the background. Sandra and her sister found this interesting natural object and brought it into the house, not realizing that it was an egg sac of praying mantises, who then hatched during the night. And there were little tiny praying mantises all over the house. Maxine Morgan's piece, These Arms of Mine, was made as part of one of the Uhuru Quilt Guild challenges, musical challenges. This is based on a song by Otis Redding, which her father loved, and this evokes memories and stories of her father for her. Cathy Fink's piece, Love, Found and Lost, was based on the discovery of a stack of love letters written from her father to her mother before they were married. Apparently, Cathy's family had Cathy's parents had a turbulent relationship, and Cathy was thrilled to realize at the end of her mother's life, when she found these letters, that there had been a real spark between them early on. So this piece is supposed to be read up and then down the other side. She used photo transfer and lots of embellishment to try to tell the story of love found and lost. This is Tammy Morrow's quilt, Negro Spirituals. This is also a response to a challenge from Uhuru about music. Each block represents a song. When I come to the end of the journey, I'm going to shout all over God's heaven, go down Moses, this little light of mine. For example, he's got the whole world in his hands. Tammy put these all together to honor that whole tradition of the Negro spiritual. This quilt is by Tammy Morrow, and it's about Black History Month. It is a group project, so the different blocks were made by different individuals in the group and then put together in honor of Black History Month. This is Maxine Morgan's quilt, Shaggy, which has photo transfers of the family dog, who is clearly a very important part of the family. This quilt is by Carol Williams. It's called School Days. Carol is a retired school teacher, so the education of children is really important to her. That's the theme of this quilt. She's also the person who made the African ladies quilt that we saw elsewhere in the show, that's about the Ashanti to Zulu African-American alphabet book. Winifred Wallace made this piece. It's called Train Tracks, And it's her abstracted idea of the railroad tracks that were part of her childhood environment in New York City. Cathy Fink's piece, Baby Makes Four, commemorates a particular moment in a family's timeline. They've just had the baby, everything is in motion, and she says in her description, this is just one frozen moment in time when everyone is still. These four pieces are my own work, Lauren Kingsland. They're all from my journal page series. When I have some particular story to tell, I like to work in 8.5 by 11 sheets as though I were writing or drawing in a journal. So these are from that series. This one right here is called So Many Ideas. In graduate school, I was told to pick one idea and build on it and make that into the project that was going to be my life's work. Except that's not really how I work. I have lots of ideas all the time. And so rather than thinking of my ideas as a seed to plant to get one fruit tree, I thought of my ideas as a rice paddy. Lots and lots and lots of little seedlings put together to make something. This piece is called The Emotional Pond. I was going through a particularly traumatic disruption in my life. I was in the process of getting a divorce, and every day I woke up with a different emotional state. And I imagined for myself that I was a pond, and each day a different bubble would come up from the depths of the muck at the bottom of the pond of a different emotion. I sing in the choir. I really love singing in the choir. It's a very important part of my life. During the pandemic, we've not been able to sing together, and we have done some Zoom choir compilations, each person singing alone to a camera, and then the piece is put together. So this is my response to Zoom choir. This is called Tree Stump and Regrowth, about having to make a change in my life and what I thought was my life getting cut down, and then up it comes again in a new place. Cathy Fink made this t-shirt quilt out of garments that belonged to her partner and musical comrade, Marcie Marxer. Cathy and Marcie have had a wonderful, long career as musicians involved in music for kids and music for social justice and music for fun. So these are shirts that belong to Marcie. This t-shirt quilt was also made by Cathy Fink. Cathy made this in a class that she took with me at the Smithsonian in 2017. And I believe that this is where Cathy and I met in terms of being quilters together. Cathy and Marcie and I met years ago at the Gaithersburg Arts Barn when they were performing there. But Cathy took my class and made this t-shirt quilt and decided she really, really wanted to do more quilt making, which is how we came to have the grant, which is how we came to have the show. This quilt is called The Road Home. I made this quilt as a community participation project when I had my studio in the Gaithersburg Arts Barn years ago. There was a home and garden tour going on in the community, and when people stopped into the Arts Barn while they were on the tour, they were given a chance to write on a piece of fabric a response to the prompt, home is ... 78 people wrote on fabric and told me what home is for them. There's everything from someone's street address to home is where I feel loved, home is where the grandchildren are, home is my happy place, home is an oasis. For most people, home is the place where they are with someone that they love. This is my piece called Blown Out of Proportion. It reads from the top left to the lower right. I was the PTA president when my children were in elementary school. We had this lovely, idyllic, happy little neighborhood. Everything was wonderful. Then there were some incidents and rumors got started and there was a great deal of upset. And as a community leader, I heard all about everybody's upset. And it looked to me like our lovely little house, the lovely little community was blowing apart. So each of the houses is the same shape, but they're just distorted and darkened, and the windows break, and it was completely all falling apart. Years later, I exhibited this piece in a shelter for women who were experiencing homelessness. And while I made the quilt to start with the ideal and fall apart, the women at the shelter saw the quilt, read the quilt in reverse. They knew about things having fallen apart, and they saw it as an aspirational piece, things coming together, things moving toward a place of wholeness and harmony. This piece is also by me, Lauren, and it's called 80 Roses. When my mother turned 80, she was given 80 long-stemmed red roses as a birthday gift. That is a lot of flowers, a lot of flowers. We used up all of our vases and all of the neighbors' vases. We had flowers everywhere. I wanted to commemorate that really generous gift. And this is a kaleidoscopic version of 80 roses. There are actually 8 wedges here, each of them with 10 ribbon roses. So, and here in the center is the vase. 80 roses. Okay. Sandra Ely loves making portrait quilts and using fabrics that are patterned and not skin tone to create the illusion of an image. When she showed this to her friends in progress, they all said, "Oh, I see a baby. I see an unborn baby in here." She had not intended to put that in, but this gold area looked to her friends like an unborn child, which is why she has titled this Baby on My Mind. Sandra Ely created this piece called Blood on My Hands, commemorating 4 children who were killed by their mother, which is a gruesome story, and makes me very sad. We're all very sad to hear about this. I think this is a particularly important story to articulate today because during the pandemic, many, many children are stuck at home with their parents who are stuck at home, and all the pressures of all the changes that we've all been through are perhaps putting more children in danger. And it's a good reminder to adults to watch negative feelings that come up and fight against them, to be kind to our children, not to let this happen. These 2 small quilts are mine. The upper quilt is called Lady in a Bottle, and it was my story of feeling trapped in a situation that I couldn't control. The lower picture is a barn portrait of a building that was on my grandparents' farm in southern Indiana, where I played as a child. Next to these is a quilt by Sandra Ely called The Slave, the Vest Family History. She has text written by one of her ancestors about their experience of being taken from Africa, brought to this country, being a slave. So this is really her family history. It's a very moving and poignant piece. This panel is the first in a 6 quilt series that I did called Quilted Mementos. That project was funded by the Montgomery County Arts Council. Thank you very much. And it was an opportunity to honor influences on my work as a quilt maker. So this is a double wedding ring pattern. Traditionally, the double wedding ring is made as a gift for weddings and commemorating love and long-term marriage. I had a long marriage, and now I'm divorced and happily divorced. But it was a transitional situation, and making this piece that is not traditionally colored and as a double wedding ring usually is, was a really good way for me to process the shift from thinking I was loved in a certain way, in a certain place, to having to recreate a sense of being loved. This is the back side of the Love Rings panel, and this is called Red Hot. It's an improvisationally pieced quilt, which means that all the scraps from the other side and lots of other red pieces I had were sewn together as they came to my hand. There's a fabric in here that has glow-in-the-dark lips. So it was originally made for the Joe Boxer Company when they made recreational garments for men. And this is about passion. This is about hacha. Shirley Hodge created this very powerful quilt called Billy's Fruit, inspired by the song by Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit, with the trees. This piece by Shirley Hodge called Four Flowers, Gone But Not Forgotten, commemorates the death of 4 girls in the 1963 bombing of the church in Birmingham, Alabama. Gone but not forgotten. This panel, called Garden of Eden, is also part of my Quilted Mementos project. And this is about that peaceful place of stillness that we have in each of us, which is always available when we need to be rejuvenated. Grandmother's Flower Garden is a traditional hexagonal pattern. I grew up sleeping under Grandmother's Flower Garden pattern quilts that my own grandmother had made. And the flower garden pieced motif seems like the perfect flip side to the peaceful garden on the other side. Sarita Brewer has shared this marvelous family pictures album quilt with us. She made this in a class started this in a class with Deborah Haynes, who told her, the quilt will talk to you, it will tell you what it needs. And what it needed was images of her entire extended family. So it just grew and grew and grew as she added pictures. She's left one spot up here for family members yet to join the family. This piece is also part of my Quilted Mementos series. This is a story that I have not been able to tell for my whole life, because this path is how I see numbers in my head. Ever since I was old enough to understand about numbers as a very small child, they have followed this curving path that goes up and down and around and around. So when I do mathematical activities in my head, I am running back and forth along this road. I don't know if anybody else thinks of numbers that way, but that's what I get. And so this is really the first time I've been able to articulate that. What's really interesting is that as the numbers get larger, I've just put numbers in at the tens, but following this path, as I have moved through life, been 10 years old, been 20 years old, and so forth, whenever there's a turn in my mental map of numbers, when I'm that age, there has been a major shift in my life. And that, as I was making this, I was thinking back, what happened when I was 30? What happened when I was 40? So I don't know if I have a prescience about how my life is going to go, but anyway, it's an interesting idea to play with. And it was a very fun thing to play with as I was working on this piece. This final panel in my Quilted Mementos series is 3 separate areas honoring 3 important inspirations for my work. At the top is a sample of a pattern called the Irish chain. It's a very simple traditional pattern. I remember being put down for a nap as a 4-year-old under a quilt that looked like that, and I had a really hard time sleeping because I was analyzing how that quilt was made. You know, here's the little square with 2 white and 2 colors, but wait, here's a bigger square with 2 white and 2 pattern. Oh, I was so excited. I was so excited. The middle panel here is a pinwheel pattern, and this is made out of samples of men's suiting fabric. And this is in honor of the first quilt that I ever made by myself, which was made out of scraps of men's clothing. I had a job in an alterations room at a men's clothing store. When we shortened pants for men, they would just cut off the extra material before hemming, and all this extra brand new material went into a box, and they let me have the box of scraps. So I made a quilt in this style out of that as my own first quilt. Here in the bottom is a reproduction of a painting by American artist Frank Stella. The original of this painting is about 100 inches square, which is big for a painting, not big for a quilt, but big for a painting. It hangs in the National Gallery of Art down at the Smithsonian. I saw this about maybe 1987, something like that. I was on a field trip with my family down to the Smithsonian. I had a child in a stroller and came around the corner, and there was this amazing big painting. What thrilled me about it was that I could imagine it sewn into a quilt because it was concentric squares, so lots of straight lines, and 2 color progressions going at once. The pink getting darker and the primary colors. I was very excited. It made, and that composition could be in a museum. There was no reason in the world that a thought like his that happened to be done as a quilt should not also be given viewing in a museum. And in this quilt by Catherine Wilson called Get Over It, she addresses the issue of depictions of Black children and watermelon. And there's a lot of interesting writing on here, the historical descriptors about that, and this beautiful photo transfer of 2 lovely, well-dressed, healthy children, Black children, who happen to be enjoying a piece of watermelon. This is a quilt that I made this summer, 2020. It was part of a call to artists to make quilts on the theme of Why I Vote, done by the National Women's Art Caucus. And I wrote on fabric, just in marker, reasons that I vote. And then I used a wonderful technique called the one-snip star to fold a piece of fabric in such a way that I could make 1 clip with a scissor and get a 5-pointed star. American history lore has it that this was the technique that Betsy Ross used to create the 5-pointed stars on one of the original flags that she made. I'll take that, I'll give Betsy Ross credit for understanding radial geometry. So that's what this is. And as I was working on this, John Lewis passed away at the end of July, and we were all thinking about the upcoming elections and voting and people being disenfranchised, being sure people got to vote. So the outer border of this is part of a quote by John Lewis that was published in the New York Times in July 30th of 2020. You must use the power to vote because it's not guaranteed you can lose it. I want to thank you so much for visiting our exhibit, Quilts and the Stories They Tell. We appreciate your time here in this virtual visit with all of these quilts. I hope that during the run of the show between now and the middle of March 2021, you will be able to come to the museum and see the quilts for yourself. I want to encourage you to tell your own story in your own way.
Thank you very much for your attention. As I listened to this, I realized that there are so many stories in that exhibit that I don't know well enough to tell you. If you can at all get to the museum, on the wall next to each quilt is the artist's story, in their own words, their story about what they put into the exhibit. So if you happen to live near enough to Sandy Springs Museum, make a reservation, put on your mask, and go and enjoy the show in person, because there's a lot of great stuff to see there. I would like to move our program along and introduce Cathy and Marcie. Cathy, take it away.
I think my interest with quilting began in the late 1980s when the NAMES quilt, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, was first shown on the National Mall. There were just under 2,000 panels, each one 6x3, with the special things of a person's life who we've lost, sewn into those panels with incredible grief and love. And there they were, all on the mall together. A year later, there were 40,000 panels. And that year I volunteered with the quilt. I made some lifelong friends. I wrote 5 songs in honor of the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And it began a journey that my partner Marcie and I took of performing all over the country for various different AIDS quilt displays, educational events, and even a tour throughout Japan, touring with the Japanese quilt volunteers who were bravely standing in front of audiences, holding the panels, talking about the lives of the people in those quilts. Well, I made a quilt for this project based on the NAMES quilt and some of the people that I knew and some other people who really inspired me. Here we are 30 years later, as I was making my quilt about the quilt, the pandemic hit. And 30 years later, I made another quilt of pictures of empty chairs, signifying people that we've lost when we expected to have them at our Thanksgiving dinners and our Christmas dinners and our birthdays and our celebrations. And so I took the original NAMES song that I wrote in the late 1980s and added another verse to it, and it's called Names. A patchwork of thousands of precious names. There must be someone that you know, woven together in a quilted frame. Names loved ones won't let go. And I know that my name could be there, and I feel the pain and the fear. And as human love and passions do not make us all the same, we are counted not as numbers but as names. We grieve for the lovers And I know that my name could be there, and I feel the pain and the fear. And as human love and passions do not make us all the same, we are counted not as numbers but as names. A lover, a carpenter, a father, a friend, a sister, minister, a mom. Each quilted piece holds a memory. Each memory helps us to go on. And I know that my name could be there, and I feel the pain and the fear. And as human love and passions do not make us all the same, we are counted not as numbers but as names. 30 years later, we suffer again. We know it didn't need to be. Empty chairs of our families, friends. The future is up to you and me. And I know that my name could be there, and I feel pain and the fear. And as human love and passions do not make us all the same, we are counted not as numbers but as names. And as human love and passions do not make us all the same, we are counted not as numbers but as names.
Thank you so much, Cathy. That was amazing. That was really, really lovely.
Well, it was really an amazing experience making both of those quilts. One of them, there are, as Lauren said, there's so many stories, and part of the story behind my quilt about the names quilt is the original quilt that I tried to make, which was a potential masterpiece disaster of physics with approximately 1,000 pieces in it. And I got deep into these drawings of what I wanted to do that at one point I just realized, you know, that replicates what the quilt looked like on the mall, but it doesn't tell the emotional story that I wanted to tell. And I scrapped approximately, I'd say 100 hours worth of work and effort and said, I'm starting over. And Lauren, being the amazing teacher she was, she said, well, that's what happens. And of course, I'm used to that with songwriting. But when you scrap a song that you've worked on for a long time and you start another song, it's a much shorter thing than working on something for 100 hours and tearing it up and saying, I'm starting over. But it was great. And it allowed me to tell the true story of the people that I actually knew who are on that quilt. One of the people that we gave a close-up of was a friend of mine named David Lemos, who was the second executive director of the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And so there's a real letter from him. And the only other story I'm going to tell you about is from my friend Jamie Bates, who was a volunteer with me, I think the second year that the quilt was on the mall, and we became very good friends. And on that quilt is a letter from Jamie where he wrote to me after we had become friends, and we've been corresponding quite a bit. And it was pretty much before the internet. He wrote me a handwritten letter and he said, "I'm planning my memorial. Would it be okay to use your music? I want to use your songs about the quilt."
Wow.
And somewhere I have that letter, but I have no idea where it is. So we just kind of replicated pretty much what it said and put it onto that quilt. And it's a way of remembering these people. And we personally know, unfortunately, a few people that we've lost from COVID, and it really made the connection for me to those empty chairs. And I originally posted on Facebook, "Hey folks, send me pictures of your people in the chairs that they love to sit in, and then send me a picture of the empty chair." And a few people sent me things that didn't have anything to do with what I asked for. And then I just said, okay, I'll just use my imagination. And I spent a weekend taking pictures of representations of who we've lost. So, you know, there are the stories in the quilt, there are the stories behind the quilt, and then there's the story of Lauren Kingsland going, "Yeah, just keep going, just keep going." Well, there's also a story behind the Uhuru Quilters Guild. And I had the great pleasure of interviewing two members of the guild, one of them being the founding member. And I'm going to ask Michael to cue that up. Carol Williams is the founder of the guild. In this video, she tells the story behind how she did this. We did the video on Zoom together, and I think you're really going to enjoy the history of this wonderful collection of quilt makers.
I am a native Washingtonian. I grew up in Deanwood, which is far northeast. I think it's Ward 7. And I, like you, had my one semester of home ec. My grandmother had a treadle machine, so I played around with that and made doll clothes. And I think for junior high, graduation present, my mom bought me a Singer sewing machine, whatever was good in 1967. And I had that machine for, a long, long, long time. I never really stopped sewing. I just got into different interests. I went from clothing and learning how to do everything with clothing that I wanted to do to crafts. And I made dolls and teddy bears and tote bags and all kinds of crazy things. Cross stitch, crewel work, hand embroidery, I love. And then I decided, okay, let's do quilting. I went to an exhibit, I think, at the Renwick, and I was fascinated by the quilts and decided, okay, this is something I want to try. I went to, I learned a lot from books. And I live in southern Prince George's County. And there was a group in the early 90s, that the Oxon Hill Quilters, who had an annual show at the Oxon Hill Library. And I went to the show, and they had a little card saying that they welcome new members. So I contacted the group, and when they found out that I wasn't a middle-aged white woman, they were kind of reluctant to add me to their group. So I said, okay, let me find something else. So I was reading an issue of Quilters Newsletter magazine, and there was a mention of a group called the National Association of African American Quilters, and they were based in Baltimore. I contacted the person in charge. Actually, she was the founder of the group, Barbara Piatella. I joined the organization, and she gave me a list of people in Prince George's County who were also members. And I contacted them. I sat down and wrote about 8 or 9 handwritten notes, because that was what you did, and invited them to a meeting at the Oxon Hill Library. 8 people came, so it was 9 of us. And we met in one of the small rooms in the library. And we decided we liked each other enough that we wanted to meet again. And we've been meeting since 1994, March of 1994. And we've grown from 8 people to 103 at the last count. At that first meeting, once we decided we wanted to meet again, we talked about a name. We wanted something with freedom in it, but we didn't want to steal the name of the group, the Freedom Bee in Alabama. We said, okay, well, what is freedom in another language? Well, how about Swahili? So we got the Swahili dictionary from the librarian, looked up the word freedom, and it was Uhuru. That's how we got our name. African Ladies was part of a block exchange or challenge one year, and they are from a book called Ashanti to Zulu, which was the first ABC book with people of color in the pictures. Margaret Musgrove, I believe, was the author. I used some of the illustrations as inspiration to make those blocks and just played with African fabrics. That's the quilt that won the blue ribbon at Prince George's County Fair. The other one, School Days, is what's called a round robin. I provided the background and the little schoolhouse on the corner, on a little hill, then passed it to the next person in the group. And other people added the apple tree, dirigible, Jack and Jill going up the hill, and the little dog. We welcome everybody.
Thank you, Carol. It's wonderful to hear the story of the beginning of your guild, and thank you so much for joining our project here. I look forward to spending more time with the Uhuru Quilters, and hopefully we can think of some other fun things to do together.
This whole exhibit has been incredibly inspiring. Needless to say, one of my biggest inspirations is Lauren Kingsland, who went on this journey with me, me being her apprentice for a year through the Maryland State Arts Council, then the two of us putting this whole project together. And the glory of her quilts is just so inspiring to me, particularly, I have to say that I love the virtual choir. I love all of Lauren's work, but the virtual choir is a piece that I felt compelled to purchase and put in our home, because in the pandemic, we're all working in this virtual world and still trying to make art and still trying to make connection. And in that art and connection, Lauren connected with the Uhuru Quilters Guild, and every one of those pieces is an incredible inspiration. And so in honor of them, I wanted to sing this song that I learned through my work with the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. The Highlander Center is the place where long ago Rosa Parks went for workshops many weeks before she decided she wouldn't go to the back of the bus, where Martin Luther King Jr. went for workshops, where people like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger sang, had workshops, did social justice work, and this song was composed by our friend Guy Carawan. It's called Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life. Now, in the spirit of community, we're going to have our virtual choir right here because we want you to sing with us. And here's how it goes. A little call and response. I'll sing, Ain't You Got a Right. You sing back with Marcie, Ain't You Got a Right. Ain't you got a right, ain't you got a right. And then all together we sing, Ain't you got a right to the tree of life, like this. Ain't you got a right? 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 Ain't you got a right to Ain't You Got It Right by Guy Carawan, inspired by his work in the Georgia Sea Islands, where he and his wife Candy went to work on voter registration in the 1960s, literacy projects, and while there, they um, took their music and exchanged music with people who spoke the Gullah language, Bessie Jones, the Georgia Sea Island singers, and much more happened. And that song came from his experience there. And after seeing the whole exhibit in person, which I can't recommend high enough, and I want to tell y'all, I'm about the most conservative person around when it comes to going out in public, even with my masks on. Ask Lauren. I wouldn't go to the museum. I directed the video without going into the museum because there were going to be too many people. But Marcie and I did go to four was too many for us. We did go to the museum and looked at everything, and it's a whole, you're having a great experience now, but seeing it in person is another whole thing. And I really recommend it. They don't allow more than 6 people at a time in. It's very carefully done. And, if you're double masked these days, I say give it a whirl.